This is Current Reflections, a production of Tribal College, Journal of American Indian Higher Education.
For this installment of Current Reflections, we are joined by legal scholar and Institute of American Indian Arts Provost Stephen Wall. I'm Bradley Shreve. A citizen of the White Earth Nation, Stephen Wall was born in New Mexico and raised on the Mescalero Apache Reservation. He earned his Juris Doctorate degree from the University of New Mexico and went on to serve as a community organizer, health administrator, prosecutor, and as chief judge of the Mescalero Apache Tribe. In 2006, Wall was appointed as the founding chair of the Indigenous Liberal Studies Department at the Institute of American Indian Arts. He is now an emeritus professor and the interim provost at IAIA. He is also author of the book American Indian Tribal Governance, A Critical Perspective. Thanks for joining us for this episode on the trust responsibility, Professor Wall.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So before we get started, I just wanted to let our listeners hear a little bit about this trip you're on right now in Australia.
Yeah. A couple of years ago, I met some, well, actually a little bit more than that. I met some people from here in Australia who administer a program at Tranby Aboriginal Educational Cooperative. And these educational cooperatives are all over Australia. They're kind of like TCUs in some ways. Most of them, though, are just fully vocational oriented. Tranby has a little straddles the line like many tribal colleges by offering both vocational and academic courses. They have because Australia is so large and there's so few people, they do a lot of their programming is remote. They have trainers throughout the nation and throughout all of Australia. And they provide most of it for Tranby is things like business development and management courses and those kinds of things, and a little bit on the academic side. Other programs provide like trades and nursing programs, but that's not quite within Tranby's purview. I was asked to come help do some work with their board and to maybe tape a couple of 3 lectures, especially on issues around land tenure and indigenous governance. They call it cultural governance. And so that's what I'm doing here. I got this Fulbright specialist. That's something people should really look into, Fulbright specialist. I was able to spend a month here working with Tranby. Then at the end of May, my term ends, and then spend a couple of weeks, visiting Australia, and then heading home. So it's really quite an experience. Something people should look at. Visiting a place like Australia is kind of interesting because it is very very similar to the United States, but it's also very similar on several negative levels. Particularly, racism is really bad here. But at the same time, the country has, I'm in Sydney right now. 40% of the people living in Sydney were born outside of Australia, have immigrated in. There's 5.5 million people living here in Sydney right now. So if you can imagine, almost half of them were born outside of Australia. So there's a little tension around that. But by and large, it's been a good experience. And serving Aboriginal communities is very, very similar to working at tribal colleges and tribal organizations. Very, very similar.
So, in Australia, in some ways it has a similar, I guess, history as Canada in that it was a British colony for longer than the US was. But
Mm.
in Canada, they have Indigenous peoples are organized into reserves, is the way the Canadian government um, did that. How is it in Australia?
Well, until 1983, there was no land recognized. There was no land ownership by Indigenous people outside of being able to own the land the same as any other Australian. Tribal groups did not have land that was set aside for them. There was no reservations. There was basically nothing in terms of land tenure. And in '83, they passed this law that allowed land to be set aside, but it's a name only. It's kind of like wildlife refuge in the United States, where people they have this land designated as a wildlife refuge, but people still hunt there. Still, there's development going on, and people may even own houses on there. There's no when they created these reserved areas, there was no reservation of the mineral rights. So the mineral rights still lie in the hands of in the states. There's actually a law that was passed that said that the federal government in Australia has no control over Indigenous affairs. It's all under the auspices of each individual state. And there's only a few states. I mean, it's not like the United States where there's like 50. I mean, there's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 states in all of Australia, which is bigger than the United States. But everything is controlled by the state, and each state is different. The reserve lands can be taken away from the community with the stroke of a pen by the governor of the state. So there's no protections, really little and no protections at all.
Jeez.
And
Wow.
there's, of course, no trust responsibility. There's nothing, none of that stuff. And it all has to go back to who came here. When people first went to North America from England, they were traders, and they were people who were into development. They wanted to open up lands. They wanted to buy lands. They wanted to sell lands. They wanted to extract resources, and they were very much interested in legal title. And they wanted to make sure that they had ownership of the land in order to actually be able to feel like they own it if they had a transaction with the tribal group. And that led to creating of the treaties. Both England and the United States had treaties, and the treaties were primarily recognition that they were dealing with people who would be able to give them legal title to the land when they sold the land. The people who came to Australia were the people who, basically the same people who went to Georgia. They were people who had been incarcerated in England. If you remember back in the 1700s, at the height of the Industrial Revolution, there, or the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, there's very, very terrible conditions. But combine that with the fact that only 150 so years before that were they allowed to sell land. The king owned all the land prior to that under the feudal system. And then they passed a law allowing land to be held in perpetuity by people other than the king. And this led to what they call the enclosure laws, where an owner of property would enclose that land and they owned everything on it. Well, the king did too when he had the land, but he also owned the serfs, the people who lived on the land and worked the land. But the speculators who enclosed land removed the people off of the land because they could make more money raising sheep and selling wool and meat than they could off the the work of the serfs, or the peasants who are living on the land. So all those people drifted into these larger manufacturing cities in England, like Manchester and Birmingham and London, Liverpool, whatever, and create this huge social problems. And industry was not, the people were working, having to work 7 days a week just to have enough money for food. It's really terrible times. And so the jails were full. They were full of people who owed money. And at that time, the laws in England was if you owed money and got thrown in jail, the only way to get out of jail was to have somebody pay your debt. Well, a lot of people were in jail. Jails were overcrowded. There was a lot of, confidence games, a lot of pickpockets, a lot of prostitution. There was all kinds of stuff that people were doing just to survive. And then, of course, the debtors. Those are the people who were shipped to Australia. And when they landed here, they didn't have the desire or perhaps even the knowledge about land title. And so, and they didn't come here for trade, and they didn't come here for development. They came here as literally, I imagine they volunteered, but they came here as a way to empty out the jails in England. And so their sense of relationships with the indigenous people here was very, very different than the relationships with the indigenous people in North America.
That's really fascinating. That history of well, let's just start right there then, as far as getting into the trust responsibility. In your book, American Indian Tribal Governance, you memorably wrote that the trust doctrine exemplifies the schizophrenia of Indian policy. What do you mean by that?
Well, when we look at the whole of Indian policy, starting with the creation of the United States moving forward, we see that, first of all, there's different policies that have come and gone. Some are really bad for natives, and some are not quite as bad. The ones that are really bad, of course, is the policy era of removal, the policy era of the assimilation period, the late 1800s, the policy era of termination. And those are really bad. The ones that are not so bad is like this period before, right at the beginning of the nation up until 1825, 1830, where there was relative political and economic equality. And so that was the beginning of the treaty period. And there was this recognition that the United States and the tribes kind of needed each other. And then after the Civil War, we created reservations, but were bad, but at the same time is better than what's happened here in Australia. And then, of course, Indian Reorganization Act, people say, well, yeah, that's really a good policy, except there were some real downsides to that. So and then even the self-determination policy, we're always trying to perfect that because it's not really, really exactly what we need. And so that's an example of the schizophrenia. And within that is the trust responsibility. And then probably the two poles on the trust responsibility is one, that, hey, we have this responsibility to take care of the property of these native people and protect them and provide them services because of the trust relationship. On the other hand, there's this, we need to assimilate these people. We need to get all of these resources into society, and we need to do that as quickly and easily as possible. And so those two poles are pulling, and that's the schizophrenic aspect of the trust responsibility, the trust relationship.
Well, you discussed this a little bit here earlier, but the trust responsibility has origins that go back well before the United States. In fact, before Europeans even set foot on this continent. So listeners have some historical context. Can you elaborate on the doctrine's origins?
Sure. I think that the concept of a trust, and this is, I think, really, really important, and I always go back to this talking about trust responsibility, is that in the Western society, money and property has the highest value in the society. Even religion is to a large degree connected to money and property, especially the Protestant religion. And so when somebody, the trustor, the people who owns the property, wants to use that property and set that property aside for the benefit of somebody else, the beneficiary, he chooses a person called the trustee to take care of that property on behalf of the beneficiary. Now, this was going on perhaps even before the enclosure laws. But the idea is that you trust the trustee. You have this sacred relationship because they're taking care of this stuff that has the most value in society, the property and the money, on behalf of the beneficiary. And so it started off, and that's the way trusts work. You know, you can go down and set up a trust right now. And of course, a lot of people who have a lot of money put money in trust for their kids because they don't trust their kids to spend the money correctly until they reach a certain age. And, I went to college at Fort Lewis College with a bunch of trust fund babies. We used to call them that. Very wealthy kids. And, they had trust funds and they had money because somebody was watching over it and they got an allowance. That's kind of, that's the basis for the trust. And that creates that sacred relationship between those three parties. The person who owns the property is entrusting the trustee to handle the property in a way that is beneficial to what they call the beneficiary. And again, because you're dealing with property and money, it reaches a very high level of those things are very, very important in the Western world and now in even in the tribal world. And that relationship becomes sacred. And so, and those things started way, like you said, long before anybody came to North America or anywhere else, long before the colonial process began. And that gets applied to the relationship between the federal government and Indian tribes, primarily through the treaty relationships. And this is why, you have trust relationship extending to federally recognized tribes who have these relationships with the federal government through the treaty process or some other organic document that creates that relationship, as opposed to state recognized tribes who don't have a trust relationship because they don't have the relationship. Yeah.
So, on the one hand, the trust relationship is a reality that affects the daily lives of Native people all over North America.
Mm-hmm.
But you also have argued in your book that it is, in a sense, what you refer to as a legal fiction. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, in traditional trust law, you have the trustee, trustor that owns the property, and he gives it to the trustee who takes care of the property as a separate person, as a separate entity. Usually it's a bank, and today there's trust companies and banks that handle the trust property on behalf of the beneficiary. So if I wanted to create a trust for my grandson, I'd take the money that I have and I take it down to a fiduciary, meaning a trustee, either a bank or something, or my best friend if I trust them, and have them take care of the money. I have nothing to do with it. I no longer touch that money. It's in the hands of the trustee. The beneficiary doesn't touch the money unless the documents that create the trust allow the beneficiary to receive so much money or so much property from the trust as it goes along. The reason that's a legal fiction in native, in the federal tribal relationship here in the United States, is that the trustor and the trustee are the same person. And you can't have a trust with the trustor who owns the property and the trustee who's supposed to take care of it for the beneficiary being the same person. That wouldn't work. And that's not a trust. And that's why it's a legal fiction.
So what we call a trust relationship really isn't even that. It's something else.
It is, it's a moral obligation to do certain things. But yeah, it's technically not a trust because you've got a total conflict of interest. You got the same person being the trustee and the trustor, and it doesn't work. And at least along the lines of an actual trust.
Stephen Wall is an emeritus professor at the Institute of American Indian Arts and the author of American Indian Tribal Governance, A Critical Perspective. We'll be back with Current Reflections in just a moment.
Yate, this is Marvin Tom, the advertising coordinator for the Tribal College Journal. Since 1989, TCJ has earned a loyal following of readers who are passionate about American Indian education. Our dynamic media outlet reaches a diverse, wide-ranging market, including students, educators, and lawmakers. And here's the best part, TCJ offers a variety of reasonable price advertising options that can be placed in our magazine, on our website, or right here in our Current Reflection podcast. For more information, contact me at 970-764-4238 or at marvin@tribalcollegejournal.org. Yeah.
You're listening to Current Reflections, and I'm speaking with Stephen Wall on the trust responsibility. Obviously, the United States has a major obligation to tribes, as this country would not be possible without all of the land cessions, the treaties brokered with Native nations. But as you've argued, the trust doctrine has in many ways hindered tribal development. So, what do you see as the best, most just way forward in regards to the United States' trust responsibility?
Well, that's a tough one. People have been wrestling with that for a long, long time. The assimilationists and terminationist policies were designed to eliminate the trust responsibility. And of course, you see what happens when you eliminate the trust responsibility. You see what happened to tribes in California in the 1950s, and try the Goshutes in Utah, and then other Menominees. You see what happened to them when you eliminate the trust responsibility. At the same time, we have tribal people who are unable to use money and property that are held in trust by the federal government because of the bureaucracy involved and the time that it gets to get the money and property released from trust, or even just the fact that you have to have the federal government sign off on them. They don't like the deal you're working with, or they don't like the people you're working with. They don't sign off on it. And so that hinders tribal development. Now, what's the answer to that? I'm not too sure. This is one of those really, really tough things that, where you say, well, if we could, maybe renegotiate the treaties. Well, you don't want to do that in times like this, because right now there's a tremendous amount of antagonism towards, number one, first of all, generally in the United States right now, antagonism towards minorities. Second of all, we're in an economic crisis, have been for the last 3 decades, and profits are not that easily generated. And so there would be a tremendous push to release all the resources and literally go back into a termination type approach. So I really don't know what the answer is. And I think that, we're just kind of, plod along with this, hoping that we can keep this trust responsibility notion going so that we can not only have our lands separated out and not coming under the control of the state like we have here in Australia, but also providing for those things, health and education, that are part of the trust responsibility. And I'd also include housing in that, because of because early reservation days, the federal government was providing housing, and it's just part of the deal, so yeah, I'm not too sure what the answer is in terms of going forward. And some people, and I might even be one of those, I haven't really thought about it too much lately, but just as things are going along, we just kind of keep going, and deal with the political pressures that arise as they arise.
Well, we certainly, as you mentioned, are kind of in the midst of that. Right now, the Trump administration, as I'm sure you have read, is seeking to eliminate funding for tribal colleges. Can you elaborate on how the trust responsibility pertains to TCUs, and what do you see as tribal college leaders' best legal recourse as far as holding the government accountable?
I think that the following up on the trust responsibility thing is probably the best recourse. Education was something that was provided for in most treaties. When people are placed on reservations from the 1860s forward until the 18, I'm not trying to remember which one of the last reservations were created by executive order, but both the treaty and executive order reservations included provisions for education. The existence of BIA boarding schools speaks to education as being a key aspect of the trust relationship. And I would, just the expectations that we have of the federal government includes, education. I mean, I went to day school at Mescalero for 2 years, so I know that, that's part of it. And as societies grow and as societies evolve, the definition of education expands. And so, yeah, there was a time, in the old days when everybody who was going to get an education, they had a teacher on reservations, but I'm not too sure how well that worked. At least that's what was provided for in some of the early treaties and executive orders. But then you have the boarding schools. And then when that boarding school concept came under attack in 1930s, they moved down to having day schools up to a certain time. I think it's up to 7th grade, and then they were sent off to boarding school. And so education has always been a hallmark of the trust responsibility. And as education changed, so did the way that as the tribal communities changed and the federal government changed, the way of delivering education also changed. So you have, the boarding school, we had some kind of reservation school back in the 1860s, 1870s, and some reservations. Then you have the whole push for boarding schools. Then you go down to the split between day schools and boarding schools. And then you have money placed into then Johnson O'Malley for those students who go to school in private schools to compensate the local schools, local off-reservation schools because of the lack of tax structure to provide money for the native students. And then you have post high school, starting with the Indian Reorganization Act, money set aside for vocational training, and then that turns into money set aside for college and higher education, higher ed aspects of BIA education back in the 50s and 60s and 70s. So then the fact that it's a tribal college doesn't change anything. It's just a further iteration of the obligation to educate Indians that was originally established in some of the early treaties, early executive orders. So yeah, it's an extension. It's a result of tribal communities evolving and growing and educational needs changing, but it doesn't change the level of obligation that the United States has towards the tribal community.
So if you had words for a direct line to the administration, what would you say as far as holding them accountable to TCUs and tribally controlled education?
I think that there's probably a couple of ways. I think constantly relying on the education aspect of the trust relationship is part of it. I think also it's, there's nothing that you can say to this administration that's really going to change their ideals about assimilation. We're moving back into a very assimilative approach to American society. And, the anti-immigrant movement and, America First and all that is you become American. That means you speak English, you do, you do these things that quote Americans do. Whereas 20 years ago, we had a very pluralistic community, but now we're getting more and more narrow. So I don't think you can tell this administration anything that's going to make them rethink or reconsider their actions towards the tribes. I think it's going to you're going to have to rely on the political process in Congress and rely on the courts for enforcement of rights under the trust responsibility.
Okay, well, thanks for your insights and joining us here today.
Current Reflections is a production of Tribal College, Journal of American Indian Higher Education. Thank you for listening.
Now da trachin in slow and shame bashes chain, but Anita Shache Traban Dashanale. I am Marvin Tom, the subscription manager for the Tribal College Journal. Today, tribal colleges and universities are uplifting Native communities, and Tribal College Journal is their voice. So don't hesitate, subscribe to the Tribal College Journal today and help support American Indian higher education. For just $29, you will receive our quarterly publication plus the annual edition of TCJ Student, which features creative writing and art. It is as easy as a quick phone call or email. You can reach me at 970-764-4238 or at marvin@tribalcollegejournal.org. I look forward to hearing from you. Ahiyahat.